January 8, 1944, 11:45 p.m., Washington, D.C., room 570 of the Mayflower Hotel. Harry Woodring Colmery sat at a desk whose surface was scattered with notes, memoranda, and the remnants of a dinner whose plates room service had not yet cleared. The room smelled of cigarette smoke that had accumulated through hours of continuous work, the particular staleness of hotel air whose windows had remained closed against January cold, and the ink from the fountain pen whose tip now hovered over stationery bearing the Mayflower's letterhead. The sound was silence, punctuated by the scratch of pen on paper, words emerging whose consequences their author could not have fully anticipated, but whose necessity he understood with the clarity of a man who had seen what happened when nations failed to prepare for peace. Colmery was 53 years old, a lawyer from Topeka, Kansas, whose path to this hotel room had traced the trajectory of American service across 2 wars and the decades between them. He had enlisted in the Army Air Service during the First World War, had learned to fly aircraft whose primitive designs made every flight an exercise in controlled risk, had returned to Topeka, Kansas, and the legal practice whose demands filled years that military service had interrupted. He had risen to become National Commander of the American Legion in 1936, had watched the organization advocate for veterans whose treatment after the previous war had ranged from inadequate to shameful, had understood that the current war would produce veterans whose numbers would dwarf anything 1918 had generated, and whose needs would require planning that 1918's failures demanded. The legislation he was drafting had no official name yet. It would become known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, or more commonly as the GI Bill of Rights, words whose simplicity would obscure the revolutionary transformation they would enable. The pen moved across Mayflower stationery whose elegance seemed incongruous for words that would reshape American society more profoundly than any legislation since the Homestead Act, provisions whose implementation would determine whether 16 million veterans returned to the unemployment lines that had greeted their fathers in 1919, or to opportunities that previous generations could not have imagined. The memory of 1919 haunted every word Colmery wrote. He had witnessed what happened when a nation celebrated victory without preparing for the men who had won it, had watched veterans return to an economy that had no place for them, had seen the desperation that produced the Bonus Army's march on Washington in 1932, veterans demanding payment for service that peacetime prosperity had forgotten. The current war would produce 10 times the veterans that the previous war had generated. The failure to prepare for their return would produce consequences proportionally catastrophic. The provisions taking shape on Mayflower stationery addressed needs whose anticipation required understanding what veterans would face when uniforms became civilian clothes. Education benefits that would pay tuition and living expenses for veterans seeking to complete degrees that military service had interrupted, or begin educations that pre-war circumstances had prevented. Loan guarantees that would enable home purchases without the down payments that veterans' depleted savings could not provide. Unemployment compensation that would cushion the transition from military payrolls to civilian employment whose availability could not be guaranteed. Medical care that would address wounds whose healing would extend beyond what military hospitals could accomplish. The cost would be measured in billions of dollars, an investment whose magnitude would produce opposition from legislators whose fiscal conservatism could not accommodate expenditures that unprecedented circumstances required. Colmery understood that the opposition would have to be overcome through arguments whose persuasiveness depended on alternatives whose costs exceeded what investment might prevent. A nation that failed to reintegrate its veterans would face social disruption whose expense would dwarf what reintegration programs required. The choice was not between spending and saving, but between spending on opportunity and spending on consequences that the absence of opportunity would generate. 6 miles to the east, in a Soviet Union whose war was consuming lives at rates that American planners could not comprehend, no comparable legislation was being drafted. The system that demanded sacrifice from its soldiers had not considered what it owed those soldiers when sacrifice was complete. The contrast between what awaited American veterans and what awaited Soviet veterans would reveal everything that the two systems believed about the value of the men who had served them. April 21, 1945, 3:15 p.m., near San Terenzo, Italy, Colle Musatello Ridge. Second Lieutenant Daniel Ken Inouye lay on a stretcher in a field hospital whose canvas walls could not contain the smell of blood, antiseptic, and something else beneath those odors, the particular scent of morphine haze mixing with the sweat of men whose bodies were processing trauma that consciousness could not yet fully register. The sound was moaning from patients whose wounds exceeded what medication could suppress, the clatter of surgical instruments being prepared for procedures whose outcomes remained uncertain, and somewhere beneath it all the distant thunder of artillery whose firing continued regardless of the men that firing had already broken. Inouye was 20 years old, a Japanese-American from Honolulu whose path to this Italian ridge had required overcoming obstacles that soldiers of other ancestries did not face. He had been a pre-medical student at the University of Hawaii when Pearl Harbor transformed his life's trajectory, had volunteered for military service despite the classification that initially deemed Japanese Americans ineligible, had joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team when that segregated unit was formed for men whose loyalty their country questioned and whose courage their country would eventually be forced to acknowledge. The regiment's motto was "Go for broke," a gambler's term that captured the all-or-nothing commitment that soldiers fighting to prove their Americanism brought to every engagement. The wound that had brought him to this stretcher had occurred hours earlier during an assault on German machine gun positions whose interlocking fire had pinned down his platoon on the Colle Musatello Ridge. He had led the attack personally, had destroyed the first machine gun nest with grenades, had been hit in the abdomen by a bullet that should have ended his participation but did not. He had continued forward, had crawled toward a second position, had pulled the pin on a grenade whose throw was interrupted by a German rifle grenade that struck his right elbow and nearly severed his arm. The grenade remained clutched in the fist that no longer responded to commands from a brain that could not accept what had happened. He had pried the grenade from his own fingers with his left hand and thrown it into the bunker whose defenders it killed. He had continued fighting until a bullet to the leg finally produced the collapse that blood loss had been promising since the assault began. The arm was gone now, amputated in a field surgery whose speed had prioritized survival over preservation. The absence registered as phantom sensation, nerves continuing to report from structures that no longer existed, a biological ghost that would haunt him for the remainder of a life whose parameters had been permanently altered by events whose processing would require years rather than hours. He was 20 years old. He had expected to become a surgeon. The hands that should have held scalpels would now number one, and the career that medical school had promised was foreclosed by wounds that German defenders had inflicted on an American ridge in Italian mountains. He did not know, lying on that stretcher in the morphine haze that softened edges without eliminating them, that legislation drafted in a Washington hotel room would determine whether his future held anything beyond the disability pension that wounded veterans traditionally received. The GI Bill that Harry Colmery had written on Mayflower stationery had become law in June 1944, had established benefits whose existence Inouye was aware of without fully understanding what those benefits might mean for a one-armed Japanese American whose pre-war path had been interrupted by wounds whose severity seemed to preclude resumption. The discrimination that would delay his Medal of Honor for 55 years reflected attitudes that the GI Bill would partially address and partially circumvent. Japanese-American veterans would use the legislation's benefits alongside veterans of every other ancestry, would attend universities whose admission policies the bill's funding would pressure toward inclusion, would purchase homes in neighborhoods whose demographics the bill's provisions would gradually transform. The investment that Colmery had designed would return dividends whose calculation required decades rather than years, transformations whose measurement required social change rather than fiscal accounting. Inouye lay on his stretcher, processing loss whose dimensions extended beyond a limb to encompass a future whose shape had been violently revised. The war that had taken his arm had also produced the legislation that would offer him another path, opportunities whose existence he could not yet imagine from a canvas hospital, whose smell would remain with him longer than the morphine that temporarily softened its impact. May 14, 1945, 9:30 a.m., Prague, Czechoslovakia, a temporary encampment on the city's eastern outskirts. Grigory Chukhrai stood in a formation of paratroopers whose uniforms bore the accumulated damage of years of combat, breathing air that smelled of diesel exhaust from military vehicles, the smoke of cooking fires whose fuel included whatever would burn, and the particular odor of men whose last proper bath was a memory whose distance could be measured in months rather than weeks. The sound was celebration, soldiers firing weapons into the air to mark a victory whose official announcement had reached them days earlier, voices singing songs whose lyrics mixed patriotism with relief that survival was now permanent rather than provisional.
Chukhrai was 24 years old, a former student from Melitopol, Ukraine, whose education at the local pedagogical institute had been interrupted by a war that consumed his generation with an appetite that seemed designed to ensure no survivors remained to remember what consumption had cost. He had volunteered for airborne forces in 1941, had been trained in the particular skills that paratroopers required, had jumped into combat operations whose casualty rates exceeded what infantry assaults produced, because paratroopers fought surrounded by enemies until ground forces could reach them, or until the enemies eliminated them. He had been wounded twice, had recovered in hospitals whose conditions reflected the resources that a nation fighting for survival could spare for men whose fighting was temporarily suspended, had returned to units whose composition changed constantly as casualties created vacancies that replacements filled. The war was over. The knowledge produced emotions whose complexity Chukhrai could observe without fully analyzing. Relief that the mathematics of probability had finally stopped selecting men for death, grief for the comrades whose selection had preceded the war's conclusion, uncertainty about what peace would mean for men whose adult lives had been entirely consumed by combat. He was 24 years old and could not remember what peacetime felt like, could not imagine what civilian existence demanded, could not picture a future whose shape had been obscured by years of focusing exclusively on survival through the next engagement. The Soviet Union to which he would return was not preparing welcome ceremonies for the men who had purchased its survival with their blood. The system that had demanded sacrifice could not acknowledge the men who had sacrificed, could not permit celebration of individuals whose heroism might diminish the party's claim to victory's credit, could not trust soldiers whose exposure to foreign lands and foreign peoples might have contaminated the ideological purity that the system required. The suspicion that awaited returning veterans was not paranoia but policy, a systematic distrust of men whose experiences had extended beyond the borders within which Soviet reality could be controlled. Former prisoners of war faced the harshest reception. The NKVD had established filtration camps whose purpose was processing returning POWs through interrogations designed to identify collaborators, traitors, and the ideologically unreliable, whose captivity might have exposed them to influences that Soviet control had previously excluded. The presumption was guilt rather than innocence, the assumption that survival in German captivity required compromises whose nature the interrogations would reveal. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs were processed through these camps, many continuing directly to the Gulag whose population the war's end had not diminished. Even soldiers who had never been captured faced questions whose implications could not be escaped. Why did you survive when so many died? The question contained accusations that no answer could refute, suggestions that survival itself was suspicious, that the mathematics of casualty rates should have claimed those who remained, just as it had claimed those who had perished. The heroes who had won the Great Patriotic War were welcomed with scrutiny rather than gratitude, with investigations rather than celebrations, with the systematic suspicion that the Soviet system applied to anyone whose experiences might have generated thoughts that the system could not control. Chukhrai's wounds documented service that interrogators could not question, his scars evidence of sacrifice that even suspicious officials had to acknowledge. He would navigate the post-war transition more successfully than many of his comrades, would eventually resume the education that the war had interrupted, would find in filmmaking a medium through which the experiences the system could not acknowledge might be explored in forms the system could not entirely suppress. The path from this Prague encampment to the film school that awaited would require years of negotiation with a bureaucracy that offered veterans nothing except the privilege of having survived service that the state had required. September 3, 1947, 8:15 a.m. Honolulu, Hawaii, the University of Hawaii campus at Manoa. Daniel Inouye walked through registration lines that smelled of paper forms, institutional ink, and the particular humidity of a Hawaiian morning whose warmth he had missed during years of Italian cold and stateside hospitals. The sound was voices, hundreds of them, veterans whose conversations mixed military jargon with academic terminology in combinations that would have seemed incongruous 2 years ago, but now represented the transformation that legislation was making possible. His empty right sleeve was pinned neatly to his jacket, a visible marker of service whose cost the GI Bill was designed to address. He was 23 years old now, 2 years removed from the Italian ridge where a German rifle grenade had ended one future and created the conditions for another. The medical career that pre-war ambitions had envisioned was foreclosed by wounds whose permanence no rehabilitation could reverse. A surgeon required 2 hands. The hands he possessed numbered 1. The dreams that had motivated his enrollment at the University of Hawaii before Pearl Harbor had been amputated as surely as the arm that German ordnance had destroyed. The GI Bill offered something different, not restoration of what had been lost, but construction of what might replace it. The benefits that Harry Colmery had drafted on Mayflower stationery translated into practical provisions whose impact Inouye experienced as he moved through registration. Tuition, covered. Books, covered. Living expenses, a monthly stipend whose amount permitted focus on studies rather than employment, whose demands would have competed with academic requirements. The investment that the legislation represented was visible in the veterans surrounding him, men whose uniforms had been exchanged for civilian clothes whose purchase the transition allowances had enabled, whose presence on a college campus would have been impossible without the funding that made presence affordable. The University of Hawaii's enrollment had exploded since the war's end, classrooms designed for pre-war populations now accommodating student bodies whose expansion the GI Bill had driven. Inouye sat in lectures alongside veterans whose service had spanned theaters from Europe to the Pacific, men whose experiences had matured them beyond what traditional college students brought to academic study. The professors who taught these classes noted the difference, the seriousness that combat veterans applied to subjects whose relevance to life they had witnessed in ways that 18-year-olds fresh from high school could not comprehend. The GI Bill had not merely funded education, it had transformed education by filling classrooms with students whose motivation derived from experiences that peacetime could not replicate. He chose political science as his major, a field whose study offered understanding of systems whose operation had shaped his life in ways that pre-war innocence could not have anticipated. The internment that had imprisoned Japanese Americans on the mainland, the discrimination that had initially barred Japanese Americans from military service, the segregation that had confined his valor to a unit whose composition was determined by ancestry rather than ability, these were political phenomena whose analysis required tools that political science provided. The education that the GI Bill funded was not merely vocational preparation, it was intellectual development whose application extended beyond career advancement to citizenship whose exercise required understanding that ignorance could not support. The numbers that documented the GI Bill's impact were accumulating across the nation with a velocity that would reshape American society more profoundly than any previous peacetime legislation. By 1947, over 1 million veterans were enrolled in colleges and universities whose pre-war capacities could not have accommodated fractions of such numbers. By the program's completion in 1956, 7.8 million veterans would have used education benefits whose total cost exceeded $14 billion. The investment would produce 450,000 engineers, 240,000 accountants, 238,000 teachers, 91,000 scientists, and 67,000 doctors whose training the nation had funded and whose contributions the nation would receive for decades. Inouye was one data point in these statistics, one veteran among millions whose trajectory the legislation had altered. He completed his degree at the University of Hawaii, applied to law school at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and was accepted. The GI Bill would fund that education as well, would support his relocation to a mainland whose treatment of Japanese Americans he had experienced only through the letters of relatives whose internment had documented what discrimination meant. The empty sleeve that marked his sacrifice would accompany him into classrooms where the Constitution's promises would be studied by a man whose experience had tested those promises and found them incompletely kept. The Soviet Union that Grigory Chukhrai returned to offered nothing resembling the systematic support that Daniel Inouye was receiving 6,000 miles away. No legislation had been drafted in Moscow hotel rooms to address veterans' reintegration. No benefits existed to fund education whose interruption the war had caused. No loan guarantees would enable home purchases for soldiers whose service had consumed the years during which savings might have been accumulated. The system that had demanded everything from its soldiers had decided that everything was payment enough, that survival itself was the benefit that the state had provided, that expectations of additional support revealed bourgeois attitudes whose presence in veterans indicated the ideological contamination that the system had suspected all along. Chukhrai navigated the post-war bureaucracy with the persistence that combat had developed and the wariness that Soviet existence required. He applied to the All-Union State Institute of Cinematography in Moscow, known by its Russian initials as WWII, seeking to pursue the filmmaking education whose possibility had sustained him through years when possibility itself seemed extinguished. The application process required documentation whose assembly consumed months, approvals whose obtaining required patience that peacetime should not have demanded from men whose patience had been exhausted by circumstances far more pressing than bureaucratic delay. His admission to the film school in 1946 was not facilitated by veteran status but complicated by it. The institution's administrators regarded returning soldiers with the suspicion that permeated Soviet attitudes towards men whose experiences extended beyond borders within which reality could be controlled. What had he seen in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in the other countries through which the Red Army had advanced? What thoughts had foreign exposure generated? What comparisons might he draw between Soviet conditions and conditions he had witnessed elsewhere? The questions were never asked directly, they did not need to be. Their presence shaped every interaction with an officialdom whose primary function was identifying deviation rather than supporting achievement. The film school's facilities smelled of developing chemicals, celluloid stock, and the particular mustiness of buildings whose maintenance had been deferred through war years when maintenance resources were directed towards more urgent purposes. Chukhrai studied alongside students whose wartime experiences varied enormously, some having served at the front, others having spent the war years in evacuation studying theoretical subjects whose practical application the post-war period would test. The veterans among them shared a bond that non-veterans could not penetrate, an understanding of what the war had actually been that no amount of propaganda could convey to those who had not experienced it.
The disabled veterans whose presence should have testified to sacrifice were largely invisible in post-war Soviet society. The state that celebrated victory could not acknowledge what victory had cost, could not permit the limbless and the blind and the disfigured to remind citizens that triumph had been purchased with flesh as well as ideology. Disabled veterans were removed from major cities, transported to institutions on remote islands and in distant provinces, where their presence would not contradict the narrative of painless victory that propaganda required. The La'am Island in Lake Ladoga became one such repository, a monastery converted to warehouse broken men, whose storage concealed evidence that the state found inconvenient. Chukhrai's wounds had healed sufficiently to permit presence in Moscow, but he knew men whose wounds had not, comrades whose disabilities had resulted in the disappearance that the system imposed on those whose visibility contradicted official narratives. The contrast with what he later learned of American treatment, the hospitals, the rehabilitation programs, the benefits that acknowledged sacrifice rather than concealing it, would inform the films he eventually made, works whose humanity the system could not entirely suppress despite its preference for suppression. The years at WWII were years of learning craft while navigating ideology, mastering techniques whose application required approval from authorities whose criteria extended beyond artistic merit to political reliability. Chukhrai learned to encode meaning in images whose surface acceptability concealed depths that censors might miss, to tell stories whose official interpretation satisfied requirements while permitting alternative readings that satisfied truth. The skills that survival in the Soviet system required were not taught in any curriculum. They were absorbed through experience, whose lessons were reinforced by the fates of those who failed to learn them. He graduated in 1953, the year of Stalin's death, entering a film industry whose constraints would gradually loosen as the system that had imposed them began the slow transformation that de-Stalinization would accelerate. The veteran whose return had been greeted with suspicion would become one of Soviet cinema's most celebrated directors, his films exploring the humanity that war revealed through stories whose official approval could not entirely contain the truths they conveyed. The numbers that accumulated through the GI Bill's implementation measured a transformation whose scale exceeded what even the legislation's architects had anticipated. By 1956, when the original program's eligibility window closed, the federal government had invested $14.5 billion in education benefits alone, funding that had flowed through veterans into institutions whose expansion the funding had driven and whose graduates the funding had produced. The investment had created 450,000 engineers whose technical skills would build the infrastructure of post-war prosperity, 240,000 accountants whose financial expertise would manage the corporations that prosperity generated, 238,000 teachers whose instruction would educate generations that veterans' children would join, 91,000 scientists whose research would advance knowledge that the war's technological demands had accelerated, and 67,000 doctors whose medical practice would heal bodies that peacetime afflictions damaged as war had damaged veterans' bodies.
Daniel Inouye was studying at George Washington University Law School when these statistics were being compiled. One veteran among thousands whose legal education the GI Bill had funded. The law school's corridors smelled of books whose bindings had absorbed decades of Washington humidity, floor polish whose application maintained appearances that institutional dignity required, and the coffee that students consumed in quantities that examination preparation demanded. He studied constitutional law with particular intensity, the provisions whose interpretation would determine whether the discrimination he had experienced could be challenged through the legal system whose mastery his education was developing. The empty sleeve that accompanied him through law school classrooms served as visible testimony to sacrifice whose acknowledgement the GI Bill had institutionalized. His professors knew what that sleeve represented. His classmates knew. The institution that had admitted him understood that its admission was not charity, but reciprocity, the nation investing in a man who had invested everything in the nation. The logic of the exchange was embedded in legislation whose provisions Harry Colmery had drafted on hotel stationery, whose elegant letterhead had seemed incongruous for words that would reshape American society. The Soviet Union compiled no comparable statistics because no comparable programs existed to generate them. Veterans returned to an economy whose reconstruction consumed resources that veteran support might otherwise have claimed, to housing shortages whose severity meant that families crowded into communal apartments where privacy was impossible and dignity was difficult, to employment markets whose operation reflected planning priorities rather than individual qualifications. The human capital that war had developed, the leadership skills, the technical competencies, the organizational abilities that military service had cultivated, was dissipated rather than invested, squandered through neglect that no ideological justification could rationalize. Grigory Chukhrai observed this squandering through the fates of comrades whose post-war trajectories diverged according to patterns that merit could not explain. Men whose combat records documented exceptional courage found themselves consigned to positions whose insignificance reflected the suspicion that their records could not dispel. Men whose education the war had interrupted found no systematic support for resumption, no funding that would permit study rather than labor, no recognition that the investment they represented deserved protection rather than abandonment. The veterans who had saved the Soviet Union were discarded by the Soviet Union, their utility exhausted by the victory they had purchased. The divergence between systems produced consequences whose measurement required decades rather than years. American veterans built careers whose success generated tax revenues that repaid the GI Bill's investment many times over. Studies conducted in subsequent decades calculated returns exceeding $7 for every dollar the program had spent. Economic growth whose attribution to veteran education could be traced through productivity statistics and earnings data. The investment had not merely supported individuals, it had transformed an economy, had created a middle class whose prosperity would define American society for generations, had demonstrated that nations which invest in their citizens receive returns that parsimony cannot generate. Soviet veterans received no such investment and generated no such returns. The human capital that war had forged was melted down through neglect whose false economy impoverished the nation that practiced it. The engineers who might have been, the scientists who might have been, the teachers and doctors and accountants who might have been. These phantom professionals represented losses whose calculation was impossible, because the calculation required knowing what might have existed if different choices had been made. The squandering was invisible precisely because it consisted of absences rather than presences, futures that never occurred rather than pasts that could be documented. Harry Woodring Colmery returned to Topeka after the legislation he had drafted became law, resuming the legal practice whose demands filled years that historical significance could not alter. The office he occupied smelled of legal briefs, the leather of chairs whose wear documented decades of client consultations, and the pipe tobacco whose smoke accompanied the contemplation that complex cases required. He did not seek recognition for the words he had written on Mayflower stationery, did not claim credit for transformation whose attribution he was content to leave to the American Legion, whose advocacy had carried the legislation through congressional opposition. The anonymity suited a temperament that valued accomplishment over acknowledgement, results over reputation. He practiced law in Topeka for 3 more decades, watching from Kansas distance as the legislation he had drafted reshaped the nation whose veterans it served. He read newspaper accounts of enrollment surges at universities whose expansion the GI Bill had driven. He observed the suburban developments whose construction the bill's housing provisions had enabled. He witnessed the emergence of a middle class whose prosperity the bill's investments had created. The connection between the words he had written and the society those words had produced remained largely invisible to a public whose benefits derived from legislation whose authorship most could not identify.
Colmery died on November 12, 1979, in Topeka, 89 years old. His obituaries mentioned his service as National Commander of the American Legion without emphasizing the hotel room drafting session whose product had transformed American society more profoundly than any legislation since the Homestead Act. The recognition that eluded him in life arrived partially in death, historians recovering his authorship from archives whose documents preserved what memory had allowed to fade. A Veterans Administration medical center in Topeka now bears his name, institutional acknowledgement of contribution that the man himself had never sought. Daniel Inouye completed law school in 1952, returned to Hawaii, and entered politics with the skills that education had developed and the credibility that sacrifice had earned. He was elected to the territorial legislature in 1954, became Hawaii's first congressman when statehood arrived in 1959, and won election to the United States Senate in 1962. The empty sleeve that accompanied him through 50 years of congressional service testified silently to the sacrifice that the GI Bill had transformed from limitation to foundation, disability into distinction. The Medal of Honor that his actions on Coley Musatello had warranted arrived 55 years late, awarded in 2000 when a review of discrimination against Asian American and African American veterans produced belated recognition of valor that prejudice had initially denied. He received the medal from President Clinton in a ceremony whose delay documented both the discrimination he had faced and the progress that his career had embodied. He served 49 years in Congress, became the second longest-serving senator in American history, and died on December 17, 2012, in Bethesda, Maryland, 88 years old. His final word, according to those present, was aloha. Grigory Chukhrai became one of Soviet cinema's most celebrated directors, his films exploring the humanity that war revealed through stories whose official approval could not entirely contain the truths they conveyed. Ballad of a Soldier, released in 1959, depicted a young soldier's journey home on leave, encounters whose gentleness contradicted the brutality that war actually imposed. The 41st, released in 1956, explored love between a Red Army sniper and a white officer she is assigned to guard, human connection transcending ideological division. Both films won international recognition that Soviet authorities could not suppress and domestic audiences that censors could not deny. He worked within a system that had offered him nothing, had created art from experiences that the system preferred to forget, had transformed neglect into fuel for creativity
whose products outlived the neglect that had inspired them. He died on October 28, 2001 in Moscow, 79 years old. His films preserved in archives whose contents documented what official histories could not acknowledge, that Soviet veterans had been human beings whose humanity the system had failed to honor. Two nations had won the same war. One had invested in the men who won it, had created opportunities whose returns exceeded what investment had cost, had acknowledged that victory obligated the victors to those whose sacrifice victory had required. One had discarded the men who won it, had squandered human capital whose value neglect could not calculate, had treated survival as sufficient compensation for service that survival alone could not repay. The difference shaped everything that followed. The veterans who lived that difference carried its consequences to graves whose locations reflected the systems that had sent them to war and received them from it.